John Callahan was the kind of man who didn't need much to be happy. He lived a quiet life on his sprawling cattle ranch, tucked away in a small Texas town surrounded by rolling hills and endless skies. The ranch wasn't just land. It was history. His grandfather had settled there generations ago, building it from scratch with nothing but grit and determination. For John, the ranch wasn't just a place. It was home, legacy, and livelihood all wrapped into one. Every morning, John woke up before sunrise, grabbed his hat, and headed out to check on the cattle. He loved watching the sun peek over the horizon, casting golden light across the fields. It was peaceful. Just him, the cows, and the occasional chirping bird. Life was simple, predictable, and exactly how he liked it. But as time passed, things outside the ranch started changing faster than John could have ever imagined. Newcomers began arriving in droves. Developers saw potential in the wide open spaces that once belonged to farmers and ranchers. Before long, cookie-cutter houses sprouted like weeds, replacing what used to be untouched prairies. Along with these new homes came something John hadn't anticipated: a homeowners association, or HOA for short. This group quickly took charge, imposing rules meant to keep the neighborhood looking perfect. Everything had to match: the color of the mailboxes, the height of the grass, even the types of flowers people planted in their yards. At first, John paid little attention to the HOA. Their rules didn't seem relevant to him since his ranch was miles away from the fancy subdivisions. But then one rule caught his eye, and not in a good way. The HOA declared that no livestock could graze within sightlines of residential properties. To John, this was absurd. His cattle had been roaming parts of his land for decades, long before any of those houses existed. Now, suddenly, he was being told to move them farther away from areas he rightfully owned. John tried ignoring the letters they sent him at first. They were polite enough, asking him nicely to comply with the new regulations. But when polite requests turned into demands, John felt his patience wearing thin. He attended a community meeting to voice his concerns, hoping to reason with the HOA board. That's where he met Margaret Hensley, the president of the HOA. Margaret was a force to be reckoned with. She carried herself with an air of authority, always dressed in perfectly pressed suits and high heels that clicked sharply against the floor. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her tone left no room for argument. To her, the HOA's rules weren't suggestions, they were law, and anyone who dared challenge them was seen as a threat to the harmony she worked so hard to maintain. When John stood up to speak during the meeting, Margaret barely gave him a chance to finish. She cut him off mid-sentence, insisting that his refusal to follow the grazing restriction was causing distress among homeowners. According to her, the sight of cattle near their pristine streets was ruining the aesthetic appeal of the neighborhood. John couldn't believe what he was hearing. Aesthetic appeal? Was that really more important than his livelihood? The tension between John and the HOA grew thicker with each passing day. Letters piled up on his kitchen table, growing less friendly and more aggressive. Margaret's name appeared at the bottom of every one, signed with an air of finality. Still, John refused to budge. Moving his cattle would mean losing valuable grazing land, which would hurt his business. Besides, he couldn't understand why he should have to change his way of life for people who didn't care about the land the way he did. What John didn't realize was that Margaret and her team weren't used to being challenged. In their minds, everyone fell in line eventually. When John continued to ignore their warnings, they decided it was time to take matters into their own hands. What happened next would change everything, for both John and the entire community. It was a cold, moonless night when disaster struck. Flames erupted from John's barn, lighting up the dark sky like a beacon. The fire spread quickly, fueled by dry wood and hay stored inside. By the time neighbors noticed the glow and called the fire department, it was too late. Firefighters arrived to find the barn engulfed in flames, its structure collapsing inward with loud crashes. Cattle screamed in panic as smoke filled the air, and John ran frantically, trying to save what he could. By the time the fire was extinguished, the damage was devastating. Half of the barn lay in ruins, along with expensive farming equipment and supplies. Several animals were injured and 2 didn't make it through the night. Standing amidst the charred remains, John felt a mix of anger, grief, and disbelief. Who could do such a thing? Why target him like this? Rumors spread through the town like wildfire, pun intended. Some whispered that the fire was accidental, perhaps caused by faulty wiring. Others believed it was deliberate, pointing fingers at the HOA. After all, tensions between John and Margaret's group had reached a boiling point. But without proof, it was impossible to know for sure. As John sifted through the ashes, he realized something else. This attack wasn't just about his barn, it was personal. Whoever set the fire wanted to send a message to break him, to force him into submission. But what they didn't know was that breaking John Callahan wasn't going to be easy. Little did they realize he held secrets far bigger than anyone in that town could imagine. Secrets that would soon turn the tables in ways no one saw coming. The fire at John Callahan's ranch left a scar that ran deeper than the charred remains of his barn. It wasn't just the physical destruction that weighed heavily on him. It was the sense of violation, the feeling that someone had deliberately targeted the very heart of his life's work. As he stood among the ruins, staring at what was once a symbol of his family's legacy, John couldn't shake the anger boiling inside him. But beneath the rage was something else. Determination. Whoever had done this wanted to break him, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. News of the fire spread quickly through the small town. Neighbors gathered in hushed groups, whispering about what might have happened. Some expressed sympathy for John, shaking their heads and offering condolences. Others, however, weren't so kind. A few even suggested that maybe John had brought it upon himself by refusing to cooperate with the HOA. Margaret Hensley, the HOA president, wasted no time capitalizing on the chaos. At the next community meeting, she stood before the crowd, her tone calm but firm as she addressed the incident. "We all agree this is a tragedy," she said, her voice carrying an air of authority. "But let's not jump to conclusions. Accidents happen, and we need to focus on moving forward together as a community." Her words sounded reasonable enough, but there was an underlying message in her speech, one that subtly implied John's stubbornness might have played a role in the disaster. The audience murmured in agreement, though not everyone looked convinced. John didn't attend the meeting. He stayed home instead, nursing his wounds, both literal and figurative, and trying to piece together how things had spiraled so far, out of control. The letters from the HOA, the escalating threats, the constant pressure to conform, it all pointed in one direction. And while he didn't have concrete proof yet, deep down, he knew the fire wasn't an accident. Someone close to the HOA had crossed a line, and they were going to regret it. What Margaret and her team failed to realize was that John wasn't just some local rancher scraping by. Beneath his quiet exterior lay a man with resources and connections, far beyond anything they could imagine. For years, John had kept a low profile, choosing to live simply despite the immense power he held. His family had been awarded vast tracts of land across the state decades earlier as part of a historical agreement with the government. These lands, untouched and undeveloped, were now prime real estate coveted by developers and corporations alike. John controlled access to them, a fact he rarely mentioned because he preferred to avoid conflict. But after the fire, everything changed. As days passed, John began digging into the details of the arson. He hired a private investigator to look into the incident, knowing full well that the local authorities might not pursue the case with much enthusiasm. After all, the HOA had influence in town, and many people seemed willing to overlook their questionable behavior. The investigator started piecing together clues, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing security footage from nearby properties. Slowly but surely, evidence began to surface pointing toward a group of masked individuals seen near the ranch on the night of the fire. One witness claimed to recognize one of the figures as someone associated with the HOA. Meanwhile, John decided it was time to remind the town, and the HOA, of exactly who he was. He called a lawyer he'd worked with in the past, someone who understood the intricacies of land grants and development laws. Together, they drafted formal notices to several major developers working closely with the HOA. These developers had plans to build shopping centers, housing complexes, and business parks on parcels of land adjacent to John's ranch. What they didn't know was that those projects relied heavily on permits tied to John's approval. Without his consent, nothing could proceed. When the first round of legal notices arrived at the developers' offices, panic rippled through the community. Phone calls flew back and forth as executives scrambled to figure out what was happening. How could one man hold so much power? Why hadn't anyone realized this sooner? Developers who had once dismissed John as a harmless rancher suddenly found themselves facing roadblocks they couldn't overcome. Projects worth millions of dollars ground to a halt, leaving investors furious and residents confused. Margaret Hensley was blindsided. She had always prided herself on her ability to manage situations with precision and control, but now cracks were starting to form within the HOA itself. Members began questioning her leadership, wondering if her hardline approach against John had gone too far. Tensions escalated when news broke about the connection between the arson suspects and key members of the HOA. Evidence mounted, implicating individuals who had acted under Margaret's encouragement, or so it seemed. For John, watching the fallout unfold was both satisfying and sobering. He hadn't set out to destroy lives or ruin businesses. He simply wanted justice. The HOA had underestimated him, assuming he was powerless against their demands. Now, they were learning the hard way that every action has consequences. As the investigation continued, John remained focused on rebuilding his ranch. He used funds from settlements and insurance payouts to repair the damage caused by the fire. New fences went up, equipment was replaced, and injured animals received care. Life slowly returned to normal, though the scars of the past lingered. In the midst of it all, John reflected on how much had changed. Before the fire, he had been content to live quietly, letting others dictate the terms of his existence. Now he realized that silence only invited aggression. Sometimes standing your ground wasn't just about protecting yourself. It was about setting boundaries and showing others that you wouldn't be pushed around. The HOA had made a grave mistake by underestimating him, and soon they would pay the price. Back in the town, whispers grew louder as people pieced together the truth. Margaret's once unshakable authority crumbled like the ashes of John's barn. Allies turned against her, blaming her for dragging them into a mess they couldn't escape. Investigations intensified, and the weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. For the first time in years, Margaret felt vulnerable, exposed. She had always believed she was untouchable, but John had proven her wrong. As the dust settled, John prepared for the final chapter in this saga. He wasn't done yet. There was still work to be done, not just for himself, but for the entire community. If the HOA thought they could intimidate him into submission, they were about to learn a valuable lesson. True strength comes not from wielding power over others, but from using it wisely to protect what matters most. And John Callahan had plenty of wisdom to share. The storm brewing around John Callahan was about to reach its peak. What started as a quiet clash between a rancher and a neighborhood association had escalated into something far bigger than anyone in the town could have anticipated. The HOA, led by Margaret Hensley, had underestimated John's resolve and his resources. Now they were beginning to realize just how much power he truly held. After the fire that destroyed part of his barn, John spent days sifting through the wreckage, both physically and emotionally. He felt anger, frustration, and betrayal. But more than anything, he felt clarity. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. If the HOA thought they could push him around, they were going to learn a hard lesson. And John was ready to teach it. One afternoon, while sitting at his kitchen table surrounded by legal documents and maps, John made a phone call to an old friend named Sam Reynolds. Sam was a lawyer who specialized in land use and environmental law, and he'd helped John navigate tricky situations before. When John explained what had happened, the fire, the escalating tensions with the HOA, and their blatant disregard for his rights, Sam didn't hesitate to jump on board. "John," Sam said over the phone, You've got leverage here that most people can only dream of. These developers, they're counting on you to stay quiet. But if you decide to flex your muscles, trust me, they'll feel it. That conversation marked the beginning of a carefully orchestrated plan. John knew exactly where his strength lay, the vast tracts of undeveloped land his family controlled across the state. These lands weren't just empty fields. They were prime real estate, coveted by developers looking to build shopping centers, housing complexes, and business parks. For years, John had let them sit untouched, content to focus on his ranch. But now those lands would become his weapon. The first step was simple but effective. John instructed Sam to send formal notices to every developer working closely with the HOA. These notices revoked permission for projects tied to John's land, or, rather, clarified that no such permissions existed in the first place. Developers quickly realized they couldn't proceed without John's explicit approval, which he had no intention of giving unless certain conditions were met. As the news spread, panic rippled through the development community. Executives who had once dismissed John as a harmless rancher suddenly found themselves scrambling to salvage multi-million-dollar deals. Phone calls flew back and forth as they tried to figure out how one man could hold so much sway. Meetings were called, strategies revised, and fingers pointed, all because John had decided to take a stand. Margaret Hensley watched the chaos unfold with growing unease. At first, she refused to believe John could actually follow through on his threats. Surely he wouldn't risk alienating the entire town just to make a point. But as project after project stalled, reality set in. The HOA's reputation was crumbling alongside its financial prospects. Homeowners grew restless, blaming Margaret for dragging them into a mess they couldn't escape. What made matters worse was the mounting evidence linking members of the HOA to the arson attack. Private investigators hired by John uncovered damning details. Text messages, witness statements, even surveillance footage showing masked individuals near the ranch on the night of the fire. One name kept popping up repeatedly, someone high-ranking within the HOA. While the investigation was still ongoing, enough information leaked to cast serious doubt on Margaret's leadership. The cracks within the HOA began to widen. Members who had once stood united behind Margaret now turned against her, accusing her of poor judgment and reckless decision-making. Arguments erupted during meetings, with some homeowners demanding accountability, while others clung desperately to the hope that things would somehow return to normal. Margaret tried to maintain control, but her authority was slipping away like sand through her fingers. Meanwhile, John remained calm and calculated. He wasn't interested in revenge or drama. He wanted justice. Using his newfound influence, he reached out to local government officials, environmental groups, and even rival developers. He proposed a bold idea. Instead of allowing unchecked expansion, why not preserve parts of the land for future generations? He suggested creating conservation areas, protecting wildlife habitats, and promoting sustainable practices that benefited everyone, not just the wealthy few. To many, this sounded like madness. Why would someone with so much power choose to limit growth rather than capitalize on it? But John saw the bigger picture. He understood that unchecked development came at a cost, to the environment, to small-town values, and to the very fabric of the community. If left unchecked, the HOA's vision of perfection would erase everything that made the area special, and John wasn't about to let that happen. As word of his efforts spread, public opinion began to shift. Some neighbors who had initially sided with the HOA reconsidered their stance, realizing that John's fight wasn't just personal, it was universal. Others rallied behind him, inspired by his courage and determination. Even longtime skeptics admitted that maybe, just maybe, the rancher had a point. Margaret, however, refused to back down. She doubled down on her rhetoric, accusing John of holding the town hostage and putting his own interests above everyone else's. In her mind, he was the villain, a stubborn obstacle standing in the way of progress. But fewer and fewer people were buying into her narrative. Her words rang hollow against the backdrop of stalled projects, mounting debt, and growing resentment. For John, The turning point came during a town hall meeting organized to address the crisis. It was packed with residents eager to hear updates on the situation. Margaret took the stage first, her usual confidence replaced by defensiveness. She spoke passionately about the importance of maintaining order and preserving property values. But her arguments fell flat. People whispered among themselves, exchanging knowing glances. They had seen enough. When it was John's turn to speak, the room fell silent. He stepped up to the podium, his cowboy hat in hand, and looked out at the crowd. His voice was steady, his tone measured, but there was no mistaking the fire in his eyes. "This isn't about me versus the HOA," he began. "This is about choices. We all have a choice to make. Do we want to pave over our history, our land, our way of life? Or do we want to protect it, for ourselves, for our kids, for the generations to come?" He went on to explain his vision for the future, a balance between development and preservation, where progress didn't come at the expense of the community's soul. He talked about the importance of respecting the land, honoring traditions, and standing together as neighbors, not adversaries. By the time he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Even some former critics stood up, clapping reluctantly, but genuinely moved by his message. Margaret's face turned pale as she watched the tide turn against her. For the first time, she realized she might have miscalculated. Far from breaking John Callahan, her actions had only strengthened his resolve and united the town behind him. As the meeting ended, John walked out into the cool evening air, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he knew he was on the right path. The HOA had underestimated him, thinking they could bully him into submission. Instead, they had awakened a force they couldn't control. And now it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. The fallout from John Callahan's counterattack was swift and brutal. What had once been a quiet Texas town governed by whispered complaints and polite disagreements now found itself embroiled in chaos. The HOA, once seen as the epitome of order and control, was unraveling at its seams. And it was all thanks to one man who refused to back down. Margaret Hensley sat in her office, staring blankly at the stack of legal notices piled high on her desk. Each document spelled out yet another setback. Permits revoked, projects halted, deals falling apart like sandcastles in the tide. Developers who had once courted her with promises of lucrative partnerships were now avoiding her calls altogether. Her phone lay silent, a stark reminder of how quickly power could slip away when people realized you weren't untouchable after all. It wasn't just the financial pressure that weighed on Margaret. It was the growing sense of isolation. Within the HOA, cracks began forming that no amount of plaster could fix. Members who had once stood united behind her vision of perfection were now turning against her. Some accused her of poor judgment. Others blamed her for dragging them into a conflict they couldn't win. Arguments erupted during meetings, voices rising until neighbors who had once shared coffee over backyard fences now avoided each other entirely. One particularly heated meeting stands out. A group of homeowners confronted Margaret directly, demanding answers about the arson investigation. "You told us this would be simple," one man shouted, his face red with anger. "Now look where we are. Projects canceled, lawsuits piling up, and half the town hates us. Was it worth it?" Margaret tried to defend herself, but her usual air of authority faltered under the weight of their accusations. "I did what I thought was best for the community," she snapped, though her voice lacked conviction. "If anyone here thinks they could have handled this better, then maybe you should have stepped up instead of leaving it all to me." Her words only fueled the fire. The room erupted into shouting matches, accusations flying back and forth like arrows in a battlefield. It became clear that Margaret's leadership was crumbling faster than she could repair it. For the first time in years, she felt truly vulnerable, a feeling she despised. While the HOA fractured internally, John continued his campaign with calculated precision. He reached out to environmental groups, offering parts of his undeveloped land for conservation efforts. He worked closely with local government officials to draft new zoning laws that prioritized sustainability over profit. His goal wasn't to punish the HOA or ruin their lives. It was to create a future where development coexisted with preservation, where progress didn't come at the expense of history and nature. Word of John's efforts spread far beyond the town limits. News outlets picked up the story, portraying him not as a stubborn rancher but as a champion of small-town values and environmental stewardship. Interviews showcased his calm demeanor and unwavering determination, painting him as a David standing tall against the Goliath of unchecked greed. Neighbors who had initially dismissed him as an obstacle began seeing him in a new light, as someone willing to fight for something bigger than himself. But perhaps the most significant blow came when investigators presented evidence linking key members of the HOA to the arson attack. Surveillance footage showed masked individuals fleeing the scene, and witness statements placed several HOA members near the ranch on the night of the fire. While the case was still under investigation, enough details leaked to cast serious doubt on Margaret's leadership and guilt by association. As public opinion shifted, so too did the dynamics within the HOA. Members started distancing themselves from Margaret, fearing association with her might tarnish their reputations further. Those who remained loyal dwindled to a handful, clinging desperately to the hope that somehow things would return to normal. But normalcy was a distant memory now. Margaret, desperate to salvage what little authority she had left, attempted to negotiate with John. She sent emissaries to his ranch, hoping to broker a deal that would allow both sides to save face. But John wasn't interested in compromise. Not anymore. He made it clear that if the HOA wanted peace, they would need to meet his terms. Dissolve entirely, relinquish control over neighborhood rules, and agree to restore affected areas to their natural state. The ultimatum shocked even those who supported John. Dissolving the HOA? That seemed extreme, almost unthinkable. Yet as the situation worsened, more and more people began to see the wisdom in his demand. The HOA's rigid rules had stifled creativity, forced conformity, and alienated residents who valued individuality over uniformity. Perhaps dismantling it was the only way to heal the rifts it had caused. In the end, the decision was made without Margaret's consent or her presence. At a final tense meeting attended by nearly every homeowner in the subdivision, a vote was held. The outcome was unanimous. The HOA would disband, effective immediately. Margaret resigned shortly afterward, retreating from public life altogether. Rumors swirled about her departure. Some said she moved out of town, while others claimed she holed up in her house, refusing to answer the door or take calls. With the HOA gone, the atmosphere in the town began to change. Neighbors who had been divided by conflict started rebuilding relationships, attending barbecues and block parties. Once again, conversations turned from bitterness to hope, from blame to solutions. And through it all, John remained a steady presence, quietly guiding the community toward a brighter future. He used settlement money from various lawsuits to rebuild his ranch and establish a conservation fund aimed at protecting rural lands from future development. The fund attracted donations from across the state, including contributions from developers who saw the value in preserving open spaces. Environmentalists praised John's efforts, calling him a visionary leader who understood the importance of balance. Yet despite his newfound fame, John stayed grounded. He continued waking up before sunrise, tending to his cattle, and watching the sun rise over the horizon. Life on the ranch was simpler now, less burdened by external pressures. But John knew the fight wasn't entirely over. There would always be forces pushing for expansion, for profit, for progress at any cost. And he was ready to stand firm whenever necessary. Looking back, John reflected on how much had changed, not just for him, but for the entire community. The HOA had underestimated him, thinking they could bully him into submission. Instead, they had awakened a force they couldn't control. Through resilience, strategy, and sheer determination, John had turned the tables, proving that sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting yourself, it's about fighting for something greater than yourself. And as he stood, atop a hill overlooking his restored property, John smiled. The scars of the past remained, but so did the lessons learned. Sometimes adversity brings out the best in us. Sometimes it reminds us of who we really are, and what we're capable of achieving when we refuse to back down.